My name is Andrea, and today I decided to share with you an experience that completely changed my life. Some may find it hard to believe. For a long time, I myself refused to accept that any of it truly happened. The memories still give me chills, as if they were scenes from a nightmare I couldn't escape. I've been listening to this podcast for years and always wanted to send in my story. But the truth is, reliving those moments, especially the manifestations that still haunt me, is something that terrifies me deeply. It all started when I was 6 years old, or at least, that's when things began happening to me. In reality, as you'll soon learn, this story is much older than me. I'll try not to go on for too long, but there's so much to tell, and I want you to understand everything I went through. My family was small, just my mother, my grandmother, and me. My father had passed away in a car accident when I was very young, so it was just the three of us, connected by a bond of love and longing. My mother was always my rock, but she worked hard all day to make sure I never lacked anything. When I was about to turn 7, my mother had the idea to leave me with my grandmother, as she would be alone during the day and could keep me company. At first, my grandmother resisted. She had been a widow for years, and my father had been her only child, so she lived in quiet solitude. But after much insistence, she agreed. My grandmother's house was large and old, built of wood and full of hallways that seemed to stretch out the silence. It was a house passed down through generations, seemingly filled with unspoken stories. Every morning, my grandmother would open the curtains, letting light flood the rooms. At nightfall, she would turn on all the lights and leave them on until dawn. In the corners of the house, incense burned constantly, filling the air with a dense aroma that made me dizzy at first. But over time, I got used to it. There was something strange about that house that I only noticed much later. My grandmother had no mirrors. I found it odd, but never questioned it. She was a deeply religious woman, a devout Catholic. She prayed day and night, and always had a candle lit in her room. She told me her prayers protected the house from any evil that might enter. Perhaps she knew from the beginning of things I didn't yet understand. Every night, around 8, she would tell me it was time for bed. We would go into her room, and she would lock the door carefully. If I needed to use the bathroom, she had a bucket in the room so I wouldn't have to leave. After I was in bed, she would sit in her rocking chair, hold her red rosary in her hands, and start praying, murmuring prayers that calmed me and lulled me to sleep. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, hearing strange noises around the house. I'd ask her what they were, and she would tell me softly that they were just sounds of the old wooden house. Then one night, I woke with an uncontrollable urge to use the bucket. I tried to make as little noise as possible so as not to wake my grandmother. However, as I approached the bed, I heard a sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was slowly moving on the other side of the door, dragging their feet, accompanied by a heavy, gasping breath that chilled me to the bone. My first thought was that my mother had come to see us after work, but I quickly realized that something wasn't right. I woke my grandmother, telling her that someone was outside. She quickly locked the door even more firmly, lit a candle that had gone out, and began praying. But this time, her voice was filled with fear, trembling with every word. The next morning, my mother arrived earlier than usual and without saying a word, started packing some of our things. We all began living together again, and the change brought a temporary sense of relief. But a coldness seemed to follow me, especially at night. I could never feel completely warm. Sometime later, My grandmother asked my mother to remove the mirror from the bathroom, but my mother refused. Whenever we were alone, my grandmother would cover the mirror with a sheet, keeping up her nightly ritual of praying with her red rosary. She said the prayers protected us, but I could tell that despite her faith, my grandmother was scared. To this day, many memories of that time remain vivid and terrifying. I try not to think too much about the moments of fear I experienced, but whenever I see a red rosary, I remember my grandmother and how she did everything to protect me from something she perhaps knew was impossible to avoid. I feel like those shadows followed us, and despite all the time that has passed, I still carry the weight of that house and the endless nights when my grandmother's trembling voice was my only source of comfort and courage. My grandmother died of a heart attack when I was 13. Losing her was an immense pain, and I sank into a deep depression. I felt like she was my guardian angel, protecting me even after death. Over time, my mother found a better job, and we were finally able to buy a small house. Around that time, I met my best friend Dulce. Her family became very close to ours, and Dulce's mother became a pillar of support for my mother and me. When I turned 24, my mother became ill, and after seeing several doctors, we discovered she had advanced stage stomach cancer. Dulce's mother offered to pay for the surgery, but sadly, my mother didn't make it. Losing her devastated me, and the loneliness haunted me. I often thought about giving up, but Dulce and her mother supported me. After a while, I decided to move into my grandmother's old house to escape the painful memories, even though Dulce warned me about the loneliness I might feel there. From the moment I crossed the threshold, I felt a chill that penetrated my bones, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just because the house had been abandoned for years. I spent my days cleaning and painting, trying to bring new life to the place. At first, everything seemed fine, but strange things started to happen. I began hearing faint noises, which I attributed to the old house. Then, I started noticing shadows out of the corner of my eye, as if someone were crawling along the floor. The darkness terrified me, so I kept all the lights on. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard something being dragged down the hallway, a sound I recognized from my last night with my grandmother. The house began to reek of sulfur, even with all the windows open. Then came the experience that truly terrified me. One morning, while combing my hair, I noticed something strange in the bathroom mirror. My reflection was staring back with a disturbing smile, with empty, unrecognizable eyes. Paralyzed with fear, I immediately left the bathroom. That night, when I returned home, I found the bathroom door slightly ajar, even though I remembered slamming it shut in panic. Now, every night, I relive those moments of horror, alone in that vast, gloomy house that seems to hold more than just memories. That night, I slept with the lights on and the door locked, and though it shames me to admit it, I kept a bucket in the room in case I needed it during the night. When dawn broke, I decided to cover the few mirrors I had brought with sheets and towels to avoid looking at them and to prevent anything like that from happening again. Over time, the sulfur smell began to spread through the house. It was a nauseating aroma that intensified at night. Additionally, the noises continued and grew more frequent. At night, the house filled with strange sounds, as if someone were moving furniture or crawling on the floor, as if I weren't the only one living there. One afternoon, Dulce came to visit. I was showing her around, but I hadn't yet told her about what was happening. I didn't want her to think I was crazy or that it was all part of my depression. When I showed her my room, which used to be my grandmother's, she said something that chilled me to the bone. "I'm glad you got a dog. At least now you're not alone in this big house," she said, relieved. "What dog?" I asked, confused. She looked puzzled and said, "Don't tell me it was a cat, because I've never seen one that big." Seeing my confusion, Dulce just commented, "Well, it's just that when we entered the room, I clearly saw something following us down the hallway, but it went into the bathroom." She was still talking when we heard a crash in the hallway. We ran to see, and we both saw the chandelier on the floor. On the ceiling, there were several small, dirty handprints, like those of an 8-year-old, but as the marks continued, they began to look like dog paw prints. Dulce ran out as if her soul were fleeing, and I followed her. We got into her car and drove to a fast food place on the outskirts of town. We parked in the square, and as we ate in the car, Dulce asked me to explain what we had just witnessed, as if I had a clear answer. I decided to tell her everything that had been happening, risking her thinking I was crazy. But to my surprise, she believed me. We then went to her house. I took the chance to stop by my mother's house. When I entered, I once again felt the heavy atmosphere, the foul smell that now also filled that place. I was filled with anger, thinking that those things tormenting me had invaded my mother's house as well. That night, I had to sleep at Dulce's. We set up a sort of camp in the living room with blankets, like we used to do as kids. I'm a light sleeper, so I noticed when Dulce got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. I was just drifting back to sleep when she returned, crying, saying, "The mirror, the mirror." I tried to calm her down, and when she could finally speak, she explained that while washing her hands and looking in the mirror, her reflection had given her a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but a frightening one. She said it wasn't her face. I told her it might have been a dream, especially after hearing my experience, which calmed her a bit. Still, she insisted that we go to the bathroom together, where we removed the mirror and stored it in her mother's room, who was away visiting a sister. Neither of us slept that night. The next morning, Dulce took me back to my grandmother's house. But this time, as we approached the door, she abruptly stopped, looked at me with wide eyes, and shook her head, refusing to enter. "I can't. I feel a strong presence here, something that wasn't here before." With a final look of concern, she said goodbye, and I went inside alone. From that moment on, the house seemed to come alive. Each night, the noises intensified, turning the simple act of sleeping into a real torment. It was as if something or someone was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to show itself. Desperate to find some refuge, I decided to move to the downstairs room, located directly beneath my grandmother's old room, hoping that perhaps a change of space would lessen the disturbances. That afternoon, while packing my belongings and setting up the new room, my phone rang. On the other end of the line, Dulce's voice was trembling and filled with fear. "I swear you won't believe it. It's not just suggestion. Something happened to my mother too." My heart raced. I asked what had happened, and Dulce explained that upon entering her mother's room that morning, she noticed the vanity mirror covered with a towel, something her mother never did. Concerned, she asked why, and her mother replied that while cleaning the room, she felt a strange discomfort looking into the mirror. She said her reflection smiled back at her in a forced way, with eyes filled with a suffering that wasn't hers. The expression seemed alive, mocking, as if something was trapped inside, watching her from within. I got chills from head to toe. Dulce hadn't told her mother anything about what we were experiencing, which only made the situation more disturbing. There was no way her mother could be influenced or swayed by what we had gone through. Shaken, Dulce suggested I seek spiritual help. She mentioned a contact for a woman who lived about 40 minutes from my grandmother's house, known for her energy cleansing practices. I decided to follow her advice. When I arrived at the woman's house, I was greeted in a dimly lit room, illuminated only by the flickering flames of a few candles. The atmosphere was heavy, filled with the intense smell of incense and dried herbs scattered across the floor. On the wall, an altar with a saint I didn't recognize seemed to watch me. Before I could say anything, the woman looked at me with penetrating eyes and said, "I sense a very dense energy around you. Several entities are tormenting you, and some are very old, connected to your family. They've been with you for a long time, perhaps for generations." I told her everything that had happened since my childhood at my grandmother's house. The woman listened attentively and explained that these entities could be attached to our lineage. And while she could perform some cleansings to reduce the manifestations, she couldn't fully eliminate them. These entities, she said, are like shadows that feed on certain bonds and emotions. They inhabit voids and grow stronger in emotional cracks. So we began a series of cleansing sessions. The woman went through every corner of the house, reciting prayers in an unfamiliar language while burning herbs and black candles. The strong, penetrating scent filled the air, and the space, though seemingly lighter, still held an inexplicable weight. For weeks, the noises ceased, but the sulfur smell lingered, seeping into the walls as a reminder that those presences hadn't completely left. The last night I spent at my grandmother's house remains etched in my memory with details I cannot erase, as if tattooed into my mind. I had decided to spend that night there as a form of farewell, but I had no idea it would be so terrifying. I lay down, trying to sleep, but the stillness was so intense that it felt wrong, oppressive, as if the very air was suspended, waiting for something to happen. I felt uncomfortable, restless, but I tried to convince myself that it was just natural nervousness on my last night in a place that had been with me for so many years. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, coming from upstairs, right from the hallway where my grandmother's room was. It sounded like something or someone crawling, as if heavy hands were dragging across the wooden floor, pressing every inch with a suffocating weight. The wood creaked at rhythmic intervals, each snap echoing through the ceiling above me, down the walls, and reverberating in my chest. It was as if an invisible being was approaching, inch by inch, bringing with it a sense of inevitable threat. Paralyzed with fear, I felt my body weigh down as if trapped to the bed. My heart pounded erratically, each beat painfully against my ribs. My mind tried to find a prayer, a word of protection, anything that would bring relief, but everything seemed in vain. My memories, which had once been sources of comfort, became a void. No prayer came, and the terror seemed to consume any trace of lucidity. Suddenly, the sound stopped, plunging the room into an even denser, almost tangible silence. I took a deep breath, trying to understand what had happened, but I barely had time to process the relief before hearing a new sound, a heavy, muffled breathing coming directly from under my bed. It was rhythmic and loaded, as if someone was exhaling each breath with an oppressive force. My eyes filled with tears and my muscles tensed. With each passing second, a horrible pressure began to travel through my body. First, I felt it in my feet, as if invisible hands were holding them. and then the sensation slowly climbed up my legs, stomach, until it reached my head. It was as if something or someone was crushing me, and the despair was so intense that I believe I fainted from fear. When I opened my eyes, darkness still cloaked the room like a heavy shroud that blocked any hope of light. I could hear the sound of my own shaky breathing, but the simple act of reaching for the phone beside the bed seemed terrifying. I remained motionless, paralyzed by fear, until a familiar sound filled the room. The soft creak of wood upstairs, followed by low murmurs. I instantly recognized the sound. It was my grandmother's rocking chair, swaying as it did every night while she whispered her prayers softly. Those prayers, which had lulled me to sleep so many times, now filled me with a strange peace. Warm tears rolled down my face as I heard her voice murmuring words I knew by heart. And in that moment, I felt she was there, protecting me one last time. With the first rays of sunlight, I gathered the strength to get up, and still trembling, began to pack my things. It was a mix of relief and sadness, a farewell that weighed on my heart. Before leaving, I felt I needed to go up to my grandmother's room one last time. I entered, and with a heavy heart, I thanked her for everything. I spoke to her in a low voice, promising that no one else would live in the house, that she could finally rest in peace. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye on her rocking chair. A red rosary, exactly like the one I had seen in her hands on the day of her burial. The shock rippled through my body like a cold shiver, but I felt that this object was a final gift of protection. Carefully, I took the rosary and held it firmly in my hands, a relic of her presence, a last gesture of love. Since that day, I carry the rosary with me as a talisman, a reminder that even on the other side, my grandmother is still my guardian angel. 6 years have passed since I left that house, but some things seem to follow me. The nauseating smell I sometimes catch in the air, the inexplicable discomfort when I look into a mirror. These signs remain, subtle reminders that, in some way, the entities that haunted my grandmother's house still linger in my life. But every night, before I sleep, I light a candle and recite the prayers my grandmother loved so much. I feel that in some way, by keeping this tradition alive, she continues to protect me, and her love remains stronger than any darkness.